Good day. So welcome to the Shareholders Equity Part 5 discussion. So this PowerPoint presentation will discuss about the book value per share as well as the quasi-reorganization. Let's discuss book value per share first. Book value per share is the peso equity in corporate capital of each capital share. It is the amount that would be paid on each share owned by shareholder in case of corporate liquidation, assuming that the amount available to shareholder is exactly the same with what we're going to discuss later as the stockholders' equity. No? Okay, so we can compute the book value per share in both preference and ordinary shares. So technically, no, ang book value per share applicable siya for both preference and ordinary. So meron tayo sa inyong conceptual framework before discussion about earnings per share. So yung earnings per share naman, yun ho ay related lang sa ordinary share. Okay, but book value per share can be computed for both preference and ordinary. So later on our discussion as well as examples, so we will describe how to compute for the book value per share of both the preference and ordinary shares. In computing the book value per share, we need to check what type of share or what class of share does the company has. So as mentioned to you a while ago, we can compute for both preference and ordinary. So let's try to check the various scenarios. What will happen if we have only one class of share, which is ordinary share lang, or we have both preference and ordinary shares, no, to compute for our book value. So for this first part of the book value per share, we will be discussing how to compute the book value per share on one class of share, which is actually ordinary share lang. So in our computation, we need the total stockholders equity. So alam na natin on the first part of this shareholders discussion na mention na natin ano-ano yung mga contents ng stockholders equity na nadaanan din natin on the other parts, no? So we have the share capital, the share premium, yung ating retained earnings, including the prior period adjustments. We have also the other comprehensive income items at saka less treasury shares, no? Now, or even the contra accounts, less the subscriptions receivable if payable after 12 months. Okay, so that's a total stockholders equity. Now, we will just simply divide it with the total number of outstanding shares. So remember guys na since we have only one class, hindi tayo masyado mahihirapan in terms of computation. So we just need the total stockholders equity to be divided to the total number of standing shares. Ngayon, in terms of the denominator, no, um, subscribe shares, if any. So, meron tayong subscribe shares discussed before. So, ito yung mga shares na hindi pa nababayaran but already been subscribed and is being paid up na on certain extent. Okay? If any, no, should be added on outstanding shares. So, if ever lang naman na meron. Pero kung wala, ang outstanding share natin, alam na naman natin ulit yung pagkukunan ng outstanding share, di ba? So, these are the number of share either issued, okay, or issued minus treasury shares. To give you an example about one class of share book value computation, so we have here the entity has the following accounts in its stockholders equity section. So we have ordinary share capital. So pansinin ninyo ha, we have 10,000 shares issued and outstanding, okay, which has a total of 1 million peso. Then we have the share premium 200,000, retained earnings 350,000. So all in all, the total stockholders equity in this entity is 1,550,000. So again, in our computation, our book value per share on the ordinary share should be equal to the total stockholders equity, which is 1,550,000 all over the total number of outstanding shares. So mapapansin niyo we have 10,000. No subscribed shares, so our denominator will be 10,000 now. Okay? If we divide that, we will have now 155 peso per ordinary share. So anong ibig sabihin niyan? 155 peso per ordinary share. That is the amount to be received by each share, no? Okay, in terms of in case of corporate liquidation. So pag nag-liquidate na, magsasara na yung company, so yan yung possible na makuha ng isang shareholder. Okay? Any question? Now let's proceed naman. What if there are two classes of shares? No? It means that we have preference and ordinary. So when more than one class of share capital are outstanding, the rights of the different classes of shareholder should be taken into consideration. Preference shareholders enjoy priorities over the ordinary shareholders as to distribution of asset upon corporate liquidation. So, dati, kung naalala ninyo, in the introduction of the ordinary share at saka ng preference share sa inyo, no, nabanggit natin that the preference share is technically having the priority in terms of dividend at saka corporate liquidation. So ngayon, in this case of computing the book value per share, merong bearing yung pagiging preference share niya, okay, in terms of book value computation. So just to continue, thus, the equity identified with preference share capital should be determined first. The balance of the shareholders' equity after deducting the equity of preference shareholder represents now the equity of the ordinary share. So the equity identified for each of the stock divided by the number of outstanding shares yields the book value per share. So to summarize in terms of formula yung aking nabanggit, no? So we have the total stockholders equity. So ang gagawin ho natin is we need first to deduct the equity identified to preference shares. So mamaya didiscuss ko ano ba yung equity identified to preference shares na yan. Since bakit po kailangang i-deduct muna? Since it has the priority. Okay? Na na-mention. Then deduct it from the shareholders equity. So we will arrive at the equity identified with ordinary shares. So yung equity identified with ordinary share at saka preference share na yan, yan yung mga magiging numerator natin mamaya in the computation of the book value per share. So bago tayo pumunta sa book value per share computation mismo, so let me just describe to you ano ba yung magiging content ng ating computation ng equity identified with preference share. So as shown here in our slide, no, equity identified with preference shares are computed either of the following. So we have number one, no, liquidation value. So ano ba yung liquidation value na yan? So when we talk about liquidation value of a preference share, so that is the amount of which the preference share will receive upon the liquidation of the company or upon the close of the particular corporation, no? So, sir, paano namin makakompute yan? In problem, of course, given supposed to be ang liquidation value, but in reality, no, they can assess how much should be the liquidation value. Okay? Plus, any dividend in arrears. So, remember, na-discuss na natin dividend in arrears. It means that it is an unpaid dividend, okay? Which is only applicable, of course, for cumulative preference shares. So, yung sa computation ng equity identified for preference shares, so dividend in arrears including the current dividend, okay? So, para po sa isang cumulative preference shares lang. Okay, pero pag non-cumulative, ang magiging computation lang natin will be okay, liquidation value lang. Wala pong dividend na inclusive. Okay? So that's the first thing na pwede nating gamitin. And another would be, kung magkano yung preference share capital, okay, plus the preference share premium that you can found in our stockholders equity section, ipag-add natin yun, and also plus the dividend in arrears including current dividends for cumulative preference shares only. Okay? So yan yung mga kailangan ninyong items in computing the equity identified with preference shares para ma-deduct sa total stockholders equity to arrive at the equity identified with ordinary shares. Now, for the book value per share computation, so dahil nabanggit ko kanina that book value is computed for both preference and ordinary, so we have now two computations. No? It would be for the book value per preference share, so that would be equal to the equity identified to preference shares all over the number of outstanding preference shares. Okay? And samantalang sa book value per share ng ordinary, that would be equal naman to the equity identified to ordinary shares all over the number of outstanding ordinary shares. So we will use this formula in computing for our book value per share. To give you an illustration, so let's use this data. So on December 31, 2019, the shareholders equity section of the statement of financial position of Spaghetti Corporation are as follows. So let me just read it to you so that we can get the details that we need. So we have 10% preference share capital at 100 par, 50,000 shares. So we have a 5 million. Then ordinary share capital 20 peso par of 200 shares, so that's 4 million. Preference share premium, okay, 1,500,000. Ordinary share premium 1,200,000. Retained earnings 5,800,000, which will give us a total stockholders equity of 17,500,000. So this is now our starting point in computing the book value per share. So yung total stockholders equity. So dividends on preference shares, okay, are in arrears for 2 years including current year. So nakalagay naman dito that our preference share capital, okay, will have dividend in arrears. So ngayon, titignan natin kung mamaya ano ba yung preference share na given dito? Is it cumulative or non-cumulative? We will have various scenario on the next slides. Okay, so please remember this, 17,500,000 our total stockholders equity, then the number of outstanding preference shares is 50,000, the ordinary share is 200,000. Okay, in the first scenario, let's presume that the preference share is non-cumulative and we have a liquidation value of 110 per share. So yung total stockholders equity natin kanina was 17,500,000. Then we have the equity identified with preference shares. So since liquidation value ang given, so we will use the liquidation value, which is the 50,000 outstanding preference shares multiplied by 110 pesos per share, which is 5,500,000. Take note, hindi na natin dinagdag yung dividend in arrears as well as the current dividend. Gawa nga po ng point na ang ating preference share is non-cumulative. Okay? So we will now arrive to the equity identified with ordinary share na 12 million. So in computing the book value per share ng preference share, so yung 5,500,000 na equity identified with preference share divided by the 50,000 shares issued and outstanding natin, preference share issued and outstanding, so we have 110 pesos. So matatawa kayo, ay sir, liquidation value, no? Yun din yung ating preferential book value. Yeah, nagkataon lang kasi wala tayong dividend arrears. But in cases na meron yon, magkakaroon ng difference doon sa dalawang yon. Okay? And then the ordinary shares naman, we have the 12 million na equity identified with ordinary shares divided by the number of outstanding ordinary shares na 200,000. So we have 60 pesos. So this is how we compute the book value per share if we have non-cumulative and given yung liquidation value. So another scenario is that ngayon naman, yung preference share natin are cumulative. Okay? The liquidation value is still 110 peso per share. So we'll start with the total stockholders equity na 17,500,000. And then less the equity identified with preference share. So cumulative tayo ha. So yung liquidation value na 50,000 shares times 110. So that's the total value of 5,500,000. Then we need to add the dividend in arrears. Remember, there is 1 year dividend in arrears plus or 2 years pala na dividend arrears including the current dividends. We have 2 years actually. So we have the 5 million na preference share capital kanina multiplied by the preferential rate of 10% times 2 years. So, ang utang natin supposed to be in preference shares would be 1 million, no? So, to add now the liquidation value and dividend arrears, so we will have the equity identified with preference share na 6,500,000. So, deduct that 6,500,000 from the 17,500,000. So, the equity identified with ordinary shares would be 11 million. So we have now the data to compute for the book value per share. So our preference share book value would be equal doon sa 6,500,000 equity identified with preference share all over the 50,000 preference share issued and outstanding. So we have the preference share book value, which is 130 per share. Okay, and then we have the ordinary share book value naman, okay, which is to be computed by 11 million, which is the equity identified with ordinary share, divided by 200,000 issued and outstanding ordinary shares. So that would be equal to 55 peso per ordinary share. So that's how we compute naman if our preference share is cumulative and having a liquidation value. So any question about book value per share? So again, book value per share are those peso equity in a corporate capital for each capital share, which is expected to be paid for each share by the shareholder in case of corporate liquidation. So the last part of this PowerPoint presentation will talk about quasi-reorganization. So a corporation may incur losses over long period of time, may find itself in a serious financial difficulty. With continued losses, retained earnings may have been reduced to a very low amount or to a deficit. Okay? Pag sinabi natin deficit, that's actually a negative retained earnings. Kasi 'di ba, ang retained earnings ay doon natin nilalagay yung ating income or even yung loss, okay? And also doon din natin kinukuha yung dividend natin and some other prior period adjustments. Now, kapag naging negative yon, okay, simply no, yung ating mga shareholders as well as other people outside the corporation, no, would actually see the corporation, ay, nalulugi na yan, no, magsasara na yan, ganito, ganun. So to avoid that promotion, no, so we have to undergo what we so called quasi-reorganization. So ano ba itong quasi-reorganization na yon? So a quasi-reorganization is a procedure by which, okay, the corporation eliminates a deficit, again, as mentioned a while ago, a negative retained earnings, by either revaluation of non-monetary assets or even restatement of invested capital, also known as recapitalization. So in this process, we will have now a fresh start towards financial solvency and profitability. So ang quasi-reorganization, hindi po siya basta-basta here in the Philippines because the corporation needs to apply it to the Securities and Exchange Commissions. Then afterwards, no, then saka po tayo makapag-proceed on these processes. So since ang goal ng quasi-reorganization primarily is actually to zero out the balance of the negative retained earnings. Okay? So ayaw kasi natin makakita. It's better to see here a zero rather than a negative amount of the retained earnings. So paano natin gagawin yon? So let's take into look yung mga various na processes, either revaluation of non-monetary assets or even recapitalization on the next slides. So kanina nabanggit that we can undergo quasi-reorganization by revaluing a non-monetary asset. So what the entity needs here is to appraise the value of its non-monetary asset. So alamin magkano ba yung mga value nito, baka naman yung fair value nila ngayon ay mas mataas, then we can use that to zero out yung negative na retained earnings. Okay? However, in some cases, no, dahil i-revalue natin itong mga non-monetary assets na to, we will have additional deficit or magkakaroon kayo ng additional loss, no, may arise when writing down the values of non-monetary assets. So, ang mangyari dito would be the resulting revaluation surplus, okay, for the property, plant, and equipment or even intangible assets can be used to offset the deficit of the retained earnings. Not only the revaluation surplus, but also somehow, kung nag-increase yung ibang mga values ng other assets natin, non-monetary assets, then we can use that now in zeroing out the negative balance of the retained earnings. Let's try to take into look for an example, no, about the quasi-reorganization by revaluing the non-monetary assets. So let's use this data. So Pi Company has incurred heavy losses since its inception. At the recommendation of its president, the board of directors voted to implement quasi-reorganization through revaluation of non-monetary assets. immediately prior to the restatement on December 31, 2019, prior, bago sila mag-restate, okay, so the pie company's shareholders equity was as follows. So ang balance ng kanilang ordinary share capital is 50 million, the share premium was 25 million, and then the retained earnings has a negative 4 million. So we have now a deficit. So the shareholders approved the quasi-reorganization on January 1, 2020 to be accompanied by a reduction in inventory of 400,000. So bababa yung inventory natin by 400,000. Yung property, plant, and equipment nag-increase by 5,500,000. And also, meron pa silang write-off ng goodwill na 300,000. So the company also recognized an unrecorded accrued liability of 250,000. So, ang unang process dito would be, let's first revalue yung mga given data. Okay, saka tayo magkaroon ng quasi-reorganization, the goal to zero out the negative retained earnings. So, pakitandaan po ito, no? Babawasan ng inventory, okay, madadagdagan ng PPE, ira-write off ang goodwill. So, ibig sabihin, tatanggalin na yung goodwill. Okay, then we will have also an unrecorded accrued liabilities. So for the related entries doon sa pie company, so una natin, sabi, di ba, nag-write down ng inventories. So we will have an entry. So kung babalikan ninyo ang inventory ninyo, supposed to be ang entry ng write down is debit ka ng loss and credit ka ng inventory. However, we are here in the quasi-reorganization. So what we're going to do is that it will be an additional deficit for us. So we will be debiting retained earnings of 400,000 and we credit inventory. So tataas ngayon yung ating what? Negative retained earnings. Okay, madadagdagan pa siya ng additional 400,000. So magiging 4,400,000 na. Okay? So, dun sa kasunod na data, nag-increase daw yung ating property, plant, and equipment. So, for the increase, although may process ito doon sa inyong discussion ng PPE before, no? But here, to simplify it, so we will debit the property, plant, and equipment by 5,500,000 and we credit not retained earnings pero, di ba, kung maalala ninyo, under revaluation model, okay, we will charge the increase first to the revaluation surplus. So, nilagay natin sa credit revaluation surplus, 5,500,000. So, next would be to write off the goodwill naman. Okay? So, kung i-write off yung goodwill, matandaan ninyo sa intangible assets discussion, pag ni-write off po ang goodwill, it will be charged to impairment loss. Okay? Supposed to be. Pero since, again, quasi-reorg tayo dito, we will be debiting it at retained earnings na 300,000 and we will credit goodwill of 300,000. So kanina, nung nag-write down ng inventory, we have 4,400,000. Nadagdagan ulit siya ng 300,000. So yung negative balance na natin ng retained earnings is already 4,700,000. So the last item for our data about pie company is about the unrecorded accrued liability. Okay, so what will happen here would be, okay, dahil unrecorded siya, supposed to be, bakit may unrecorded? Ibig sabihin, meron kang hindi na record na expense. But instead of putting it as an expense, we will be charging it against retained earnings. So we will debit retained earnings sa 250,000 and we credit accrued liabilities of 250,000. Ayan, nadagdagan ulit ng 250,000 yung 4,700,000 mula dun sa nakaraan. So ngayon, after considering this, ang total deficit na ng ating retained earnings after all of the revaluation and write-off is 4,950,000. So yun yung i-zero out natin, yung 4,950,000. So to do that, since meron tayong enough na revaluation surplus, so we will use the revaluation surplus. So we will debit the revaluation surplus, not the 5,500,000. Ang goal lang ng quasi-reorg ay is zero. Ulitin ko, is zero lang. Hindi po kailangan lagyan ng sobra. Okay, so to zero it out, ika-cancel natin yung revaluation surplus na only 4,950,000 and we will credit retained earnings na 4,950,000. So pag na-post na yan sa inyong ledger, so yung deficit or debit balance ng retained earnings sa 4,950,000, nag-credit ka ng 4,950,000, so na-zero out na natin. So yes, meron pa tayong natitirang balance nung ating revaluation surplus, which is actually kung 5,500,000 yon minus 4,950,000, the remaining revaluation surplus is still 550,000. So it will stay as a revaluation surplus. So that's how we use the quasi-reorganization in revaluing a non-monetary asset. Okay, any question? So we're down to the last part of our discussion for this part 5. Okay, so the quasi-reorganization through recapitalization. So if our amount of the revaluation is not enough, no, to zero out the particular negative or deficit na retained earnings, then we can push through with recapitalization. So itong recapitalization, okay, is normally undertaken to establish additional paid-in capital account that will be used in capital restructuring or quasi-reorganization. So in this process of recapitalization, it can done by either or both of a change in the par or stated value ng ating shares o kaya naman no an exchange of par to no par or vice versa. So actually ang primary purpose nito is to establish the recapitalization is used to establish a share premium o kaya naman additional paid in capital para yun naman yung gagamitin natin to zero out the retained earnings. Kanina, ang ginamit natin, revaluation surplus. Ngayon dito, share premium na. Okay, now, what will be the process or step na i-undergo natin sa recapitalization? So, number 1 is i-write down yung mga assets, okay, or net realizable value ng ating particular na mga non-monetary assets. So, i-write down yung mga yon. Okay, sir, bakit kailangan i-write down? Kasi nga we need to update the value of the deficit. Okay, then affecting the recapitalization, so we are creating enough share premium to absorb the resulting deficit. So mamaya meron tayong papakitang entry about the recapitalization. Actually, ang mangyari lang dyan, yung number of shares na meron, hindi magbabago. Yung par natin or stated value, yun yung gagalaw. Now, pag gumalaw kasi yon with the same number of shares, of course, bababa yung ating share capital at yung excess ngayon nun mapupunta naman sa share premium. Okay? And afterwards, no, we will cancel now the deficit using the share premium. So to understand how recapitalization works, so let's have Nuggets Company has incurred heavy losses since its inception. At the recommendation of the President, the Board of Directors voted to implement quasi-reorganization through reduction of par value subject to shareholders' approval. Immediately prior to the restatement, okay, we have the following balances of Nugget Company's shareholders equity section. So we have now the ordinary share capital, 100 yung par as you can see here with 500,000 shares. Now we have 50 million. Then you have the ordinary share premium of 25 million. Accumulated losses, that's actually the same with the retained earnings, okay, na accumulated losses na negative 3 or 30 million. Okay, so that's our deficit right now, okay, prior to the restatement. So the shareholders approved the quasi-reorganization on January 1, 2020 to be accompanied by a reduction in inventory of 4 million. Okay, may reduction ulit. Then reduction as well to PPE, okay, na 5,500,000. Write-off of goodwill at 3 million. Tapos meron din tayong unrecorded accrued liabilities na 2,500,000. So the par value of the company will change from 100 peso to 50 peso. So tandaan niyo yung mga details na yan. We will give the entries so that we could arrive to the zero amount of our retained earnings. Okay, so remember in our previous slides discussion about the capitalization, so the process will start on the writing off of our non-monetary assets. Okay, so on the given data about Nuggets company, so we will have a decrease in inventory or write down inventory worth 4 million. So to record it, debit retained earnings 4 million and credit inventory 4 million. So nadagdagan ulit yung ating 30 million kanina na deficit ng 4 million. So we have already 34 million. Okay? In addition, meron ding decrease or reduction sa ating property, plant, and equipment by 5,500,000. So to reduce it, we debit retained earnings, no, 5,500,000, and we credit property, plant, and equipment, 5,500,000. So because of that, again, from 34 million plus 5,500,000, ang deficit na natin ngayon ay 39,500,000. So padagdag na padagdag, no, kasi decrease yung mga nare-record natin eh. Now, in terms of the goodwill, nag-write off tayo ng goodwill. So we debit retained earnings and we credit goodwill amounting to 3 million. So from 49,500 na deficit, 39,500 na deficit, nadagdagan siya ng 3,000. So we have now 42,500 na total deficit. So to continue, let's see the next slide. So our last related item is all about the unrecorded accrued liabilities. So ang gagawin natin dyan, okay, is to record it. Na-mention ko kanina na since it should have a related expense na hindi na-record, charge it to retained earnings, di ba? So now, we will be debiting retained earnings at 2,500,000 and we credit now the accrued liabilities of 2,500,000. So pag sinum up mo lahat yung naging effect sa retained earnings, okay, the negative balance now of the retained earnings is already 45 million pesos. So yun yung dapat nating eliminate at ma-zero out yung 45 million pesos na negative retained earnings. So how are we going to do that? So now let's number 2, di ba? Sabi dun sa step, effect a recapitalization. So sa recapitalization, ang nangyari based on the given data, yung 100 na par magiging 50. So ito yung mangyari, no? We will be retiring the old 100 peso par na ordinary share capital. So we will debit ordinary share capital na 100 peso par na 50 million. Okay? So ngayon, papalitan natin siya with an ordinary share capital, okay, na 50 par. So yung 500,000 na shares times 50 pesos, that will be equal now to 25 million. Okay, ngayon yung difference nila, ayan na. Tataas na po yung ating ordinary share premium by 25 million. So that's the entry to record the recapitalization. Ngayon ho, no, kung mapapansin niyo previously dun sa given data ni Nuggets, ordinary share premium niya is 25 million, di ba? Okay, plus nadagdagan pa siya dito using the recapitalization ng additional 25 million. So all in all, we have a total ordinary share premium of 50 million. Now, is it enough to zero out the negative retained earnings? Yes, kasi 45 million lang naman yon. So the last entry is all about using the share premium to zero out the deficit. So again, hindi mo pwedeng ilagay yung buong share premium. Kagaya kanina, di ba, yung rebal natin, ang nilagay lang natin sa retained earnings is kung magkano yung kulang sa retained earnings para ma-zero. Ngayon, same din. Kung magkano lang yung negative balance ng retained earnings, yun lang ita-transfer natin na ordinary share premium. So we just debit ordinary share premium at 45 million and we credit now retained earnings at 45 million. So after this, no, we have already zero balance of the retained earnings. So medyo mas malinis ng tignan. And we hope na sana yung company will prosper on the succeeding year so that hindi na siya magkaroon ng any problems pa about this, no, na negative yung kanyang retained earnings. Okay? And also take note na from 50 million na ordinary share premium na meron tayo after recapitalization, no? After nitong entry ng Quasi-Reorganization, we will now have to reduce it by 45 million. Thus, the remaining balance of our ordinary share premium is now 5 million na lang. Okay? So any question about the Quasi-Reorganization? Again, to recap, about Quasi-Reorganization, its purpose is to zero out the negative retained earnings by either revaluing our asset, non-monetary assets, or even by having a recapitalization. So I hope na naintindihan natin. So this is the end now of our shareholders equity discussion. Okay, so yung mga contents ng shareholders equity na supposed to be makita ninyo in totality, so break down natin siya, okay, into 5 parts. So for our next week's discussion, so we will talk about now, still again part of the shareholders equity, but we will be discussing it under the standard of IFRS number 2, which is share-based payments. Okay, so I hope that naintindihan ninyo. If you do have any questions, please feel free to PM me. Kaya naman, um, email me or even put it in our teams. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for listening and have a great day.